Добър вечер. За мен е изключително удоволствие да ви приветствам тук от името на Център за либерални стратегии, мое име, на лекцията в памет на нашата колега и приятел Юлия Гурковска. Лекция, която ще бъде изнесена от професор Соли Йозел. Тази лекция, мемориална лекция, се случва вече 12-та година подред. И това е един малък наш знак, жест към огромната следа, която оставя след себе си Юлия Гурковска или Джу, както всички ние знаем. Джу е забележителен човек. И когато се казва за някой, че той оставя следа, обикновено в този израз се влага метафора. В нашата заседателна зала има една навигационна карта. Това е всъщност истинската навигационна карта, която Джу, Дончо и Яна са използвали при обиколката им с яхта около света. И на тая карта всъщност е следата от самото пътешествие. Така че в нейния случай следата не е само метафора, тя има реален, материален израз. И това е само началото. Това начало, което само по себе си е забележително, защото от страна от Съветския блок, страна, която всички са смятали за една от най-затворените, от страна, в която е било трудно да пътуваш до Георгиево и до Турно Магореле, без да извадиш един куп разрешение, в крайна сметка се оказало възможно, ако силно вярваш в една кауза, да осъществиш, дори когато тази кауза е да обиколиш света с лодка, с яхта. Това е, може би, началото на пътешествието на Юлия Гурковска. И тук бих искал да кажа, че когато говорим за обиколка на света по море, има известна доза авантюризъм в това нещо. Всички сме чели романи, пиратски романи в детството си. Но помислете, че когато правиш едно такова пътешествие с семейството си, с малко детенце, освен авантюризма и така желанието за приключение, освен силната вяра в една мечта, всъщност ти трябва да вложиш много сериозна организация в това пътешествие. Качества, които са изключителни, които правят забележително. И тя и семейството, които са успяли да постигнат всичко това. Сега за другата следа, която искам да говоря, и която е много видима в Центъра за либерални стратегии, това е политическата следа. Струваме се много важно, че нещо, което ние като институция сме взели от Джуе, това разбиране, че в политиката има етическа и човешка основа. Вулгарният макиавелизъм е бил чужд. И на нея ми се струва, че и ние се стремим да влагаме такова разбиране в политиката. Все пак има една морална основа, има една човешка основа, над която политиката надгражда. Тя стъпва на нея и без нея тя не може. Когато тази основа отсъства или когато тя е нарушена, самата политика също се проваля. Това ми се струва и в сегашната ситуация нещо важно, което трябва да подчертая. Сега, днешната лекция ще бъде фокусирана върху протестите. И нейното заглавие трудно може да бъде по-актуално. То е от протести към политики. всъщност, може би от протести към оставка би било още по-актуално, но така или иначе, нека да видим по-голямата картина. Професор Соли Йозел е, може би, един от най-подходящите хора в света да ни даде тази по-голяма картина. Да видим как протестите се случват и на други места. Какъв е техният потенциал, какъв е техният морален заряд, каква е тяхната социална основа и доколко те са в състояние да променят политиката, не само в краткосрочен план, което те очевидно правят, но и да оставят и по-значима следа в политическото развитие от тук нататък. Така че аз очаквам тази лекция с огромен интерес. Професор Йозел е всъщност много утвърден академичен учен от една страна, и от друга страна много известен политически анализатор. Неговите текстове може да ги четете както в най-престижните академически списания, така и в издания като Washington Post, издания, които формират международното мнение. Така че, позволете ми сега да дам думата на професор Йозел.
Thank you for this over-generous and therefore intimidating introduction. I usually don't fear public speeches or presentations. As we have a saying in Turkish, I've eaten the grass of 40 springs. Basically means I've been around. But I must say that I have felt, if not intimidated, certainly I felt under a lot of pressure since I've been invited to give this lecture. And the fact that my iPad just blew on me made the pressure on me even more, because that's where I had my notes. Now, but the reason why I was kind of intimidated had to do with the person I was going to be speaking in memoriam of, and I felt that was a big responsibility. And now, I speak a lot, but I don't do two things well. I don't usually speak well from a written text, which is what I'm going to do. And second, I'm awful sitting down. I usually walk around when I speak, and I can't do that either. So after having tried to cover myself for any deficiencies that my talk might have, let me start. In fact, I was in that room the last time I was in Sofia, in a conference that the Center has organized before. Welcome and thank you for being with us tonight. I've never met Julia Burkowska, Jew to you, since I have learned her name for the first time. I saw her pictures, learned about her life, was informed about her aspirations and struggles. Knowing what I know now, I feel especially privileged and honored to be here in Sofia with you to speak about the continuing struggle in many societies to shape a more decent society, responsible and responsive government, and an equitable economic system. I thank from the depth of my heart the Center for Liberal Strategies and all my good friends there who gave me this honor and made this possible. Jew who, with her husband Doncho, took the most symbolically courageous step of seeking freedom in the vastness of oceans, in the discipline of sailing and surviving, would have been in her element in today's world as well. Or so I'm led to believe. She could be, as I understand she was throughout her life, an aspiration for those who seek to change things in defiance of the odds, brutality of states, and of the suffocating repressiveness of political populism or elitism that parades as democracy. It is in that spirit that I wish to share with you the views I hold about our age and how the future of rule-based, justice-oriented, and egalitarian participatory democracy might look. We seek to understand whether or not the future will be bright or somber in terms of democratic governance, justice, and freedom. We wish to know whether or not what I believe to be the defining principle of the times to come, that is equality, will be attained. As in the past, the answers will be determined to a large extent by the choices of the middle classes. It is a firmly established belief that without the middle classes, it is nearly impossible to build a democracy. This is what modernization theory, in many of its iterations, told us. And one reading of the historical record certainly supported this view. However, the historical record is not as clear as this formulation would indicate. The middle classes do indeed make choices that determine political outcomes. It is not a foregone conclusion, though, that the choices they make will always be in favor of democracy. Many instances in Europe's own history, from the revolutions of 1848 to the revolutions of 1919 to the rise of Nazism, give us ample reason to be careful about easy and convenient generalizations. Nonetheless, the axiom still holds that you need the middle classes to have a liberal democratic order. At the end of the day, the custodians of liberal principles, whether these be in social, cultural, economic, or political terms, have historically, if not always consistently, been the middle classes. In our day, we must distinguish between different categories of middle classes as well. In different parts of the world, we see movements, rallies, strikes, demonstrations, sit-ins, what have you, abound. Most often they are leaderless, devoid of organization, and frequently with no organic links to existing political parties, organizations. In many senses, we have a new phenomenon, perhaps the harbinger of the politics of the 21st century. When you take stock of the demonstrations that have been happening around the world, you cannot fail to note that they happened everywhere. In countries that have no visible commonalities with one another. After all, indignados of Spain and the angry protesters of Syntagma Square in Greece are citizens of countries that are being impoverished, where the youth of the middle classes have diminished, if any hopes, of a better future. Israel, where a social justice movement sprang up 2 summers ago, is an economic powerhouse in its own right. Turkey had a pretty good decade of economic growth. India, until recently, along with Brazil, had a steadily rising income, and together made part of the BRIC countries, was looking forward to multiplying its national income. Thailand, a pretty interesting case, has been shaken by massive demonstrations, coups and elections that were protested for the better part of the past decade. Chile, the golden case of the Chicago School, witnessed mass student protests that finally gave us a face and a name to recognize, as Camilla Vallejo joined the Chilean parliament at the age of 23. Russia, with all the gas and oil wealth, was not immune to protest by its own middle classes. The Arab revolts, the most spectacular of the bunch perhaps, shook to its foundation an order that not even the most optimistic observers of the Arab world expected to see happening then. That the Arab revolts culminated in the bloodbath of Syria and the colossal failure of the self-serving Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the coup does not take away from the importance of the demographic, social, and economic conditions exacerbated by ossified political regimes that gave rise to them. In all these instances, we saw the rising forces losing the round to established forces of order, or to organize political movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood. Robocops in all countries, standing, you know what robocops are, right? We cannot not know. Robocops in all countries, standing for an ever more intrusive, if not repressive state, used the same tools with lesser or greater efficiency wherever the demonstrations, revolts, strikes, voiced demands for a better order, future or politics. In all these instances, the middle classes took the lead. As Slavoj Žižek suggested, by the way, he writes much faster than I can read. I don't know how he gets to that, but he does. These are not proletarian protests, but protests against the threat of being reduced to proletarians. Who dares strike today when having a permanent job is itself a privilege? Not low-paid workers in what remains of the textile industry, etc., but those privileged workers who have guaranteed jobs, teachers, public transport workers, police. This also accounts for the wave of student protests. Their main motivation is arguably the fear that higher education will no longer guarantee them a surplus wage in later life. In fact, in the United States, many students are asking the following question. Can I get out of college with $200,000 worth of debts on my back and actually repay it? And the answer appears increasingly to be no, and therefore what you see is a declining rate of attendance of university in the United States, which used to be the uncontested #1 in terms of attainment of college education. At the same time, it is clear that the huge revival of protest over the past year, from the Arab Spring to Western Europe, from Occupy Wall Street to China, from Spain to Greece, should not be dismissed merely as a revolt of the salaried bourgeoisie. Each case should be taken on its own merits. The student protests against university reform in the UK were clearly different from August riots, which were a consumerist carnival of destruction, a true outburst of the excluded. One could argue that the uprisings in Egypt began in part as a revolt of the salaried bourgeoisie, with educated young people protesting about their lack of prospects. But this was only one aspect of a larger protest against an oppressive regime. On the other hand, the protest didn't really mobilize poor workers and peasants, and the Islamist electoral victory makes clear the narrow social base of the original secular one. Greece is a special case. In the last decades, a new salaried bourgeoisie, especially in the overextended state administration, was created thanks to the EU financial help, and the protests were motivated in large part by the threat of an end to this. Žižek, in my view, is partly correct in identifying, like many other authors, in these social movements, a revolt against a particular type of globalization. He sees here a resistance after nearly 35 years of ascendance to the hegemony of neoliberal economic policies, to the dictates of financial capital. But there is also more to these revolts. Within many countries, developed or developing, what I would call status middle classes that are being sidelined or eclipsed by the market or aspiring middle classes are resisting their own demands. In Thailand, for instance, this is transformed into recurring rebellions against the populist rule of Yingluck Shinawatra, and before her and certainly behind her, her brother Thaksin Shinawatra. The Thai case, in fact, is a good example of a middle-class rebellion that is far from being a democratic one. The established elites of Thailand never reconciled themselves to the rule of Thaksin or her sister representing peripheral social and economic forces. These forces benefited immensely from the policies of the Shinawatras. So an unarguably democratic process has ended up with plebeian majoritarian rule opposed by established elites who insistently call for the military to intervene. In fact, the Thai case, just like the Turkish case that I will treat later, speaks to yet another peril that awaits democracies, whether they're consolidated or not. And that is the temptation to rule on the basis of majoritarianism rather than pluralism. In short, the threat to democracy, as we come to understand it, comes from all directions. An economic system that privileges the economically powerful and is less and less inclined to protect the bottom segments of the population. An understanding of democracy that is gradually devoid of liberal principles. A system of political parties defined and designed in the 19th century, reflecting its class realities, that is of the 19th century, in the context of sovereign nation states, which is at a loss today in the 21st century. This brings me to an observation made by someone who happens to be one of my favorite authors these days, an Indian guy by the name of Pankaj Mishra, quote, that mass democracy and capitalism, far from being natural partners, are antagonists in the age of globalization. It has become clearer since then that the demands and needs of the majority cannot be fulfilled by the assurances of private wealth creation. Gross domestic product growth rates, however impressive, have not made up for poor infrastructure, education, and healthcare in many of those cases. And inequality like corruption and nepotism among the elites has become more intolerable. The governments, too, are helpless to a certain degree. Incessantly mobile labor and capital, not mobile labor, but capital, has eroded the power of national governments to devise policies aimed at creating an equitable society. The middle classes, to the extent that they participated in and promoted this kind of economic system that worked to their benefit, are now becoming more and more anxious about many of this system's consequences. Whether it be the growing insecurities generated by relentless competition, or the commodification of all aspects of life, or the violation of what David Harvey called the right to the city, many aspects of the prevailing order are either hurting or bothering the middle classes too. Technocratic wisdom, parading as economic imperative, finally wore out. As Ivan Krastev never tries of repeating, politics is suspended in favor of one-size-fits-all policies. Under such circumstances, it is not just politics, but certainly democratic politics and the pleasures of democratic citizenship that suffer immensely. To return to another observation by Mishra, what we witness today are citizens revolting against their own previous apathy. It remains to be seen what this fresh infusion of the masses into political life amounts to. But we have already made some progress when democracy begins to mean something more than routine elections and the retreat from political life. It is from this perspective that I would also look at what is happening in the Ukraine. At one level, people who are demonstrating appear to be in a quixotic fight. In a deeply divided society, the grip of Russia is unfailingly felt, economically, politically. But under such circumstances, the Ukrainian middle classes too took to the streets. And by doing so, resurrected the values and aspirations that members of the European Union themselves appear to have lost faith in. They are on the public squares, mobilized by certain values, and trying to avoid a fate that they only know too well. As Chrystia Freeland puts it, the people have taken to the streets in support of political values rather than nationalist ones or short-term economic interests. From Washington to Warsaw, democratic capitalism is demoralized. Our political institutions aren't up to the challenges of the 21st century. And the economy isn't delivering for the middle class in the way it did during the post-war era, when the original version of the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, that is the Cold War, was at its peak. Now, I thought about it, whether I'd be more offending if I spoke about Bulgaria or if I didn't. To speak to a Bulgarian audience as a non-Bulgarian who admittedly has not followed your developments very closely, I would be putting myself at risk of being unwillingly at the wrong spot. On the other hand, it really offends my sense of fairness not to say at least a couple of words that I'm parroting from what I've learned from my colleagues here. Now, the Bulgarian case is actually the most long-lived one, but unfortunately, it got caught between three giant events. It got caught between Turkey, Brazil, and then Egypt. So the international media did not have enough cameras to send over here, I suppose, because it was so overwhelmed by those events that were considered, rightly or wrongly, as more attention-grabbing. But I must say that I am truly impressed that it's been now 172 days since your demonstrations have begun. And it seems to me, based on what I've learned, that it is also a demand on the part of the middle classes for the principles of political liberalism to be enshrined in your political system. And it is also, like the Ukrainian case, as I understand it, that what you ask for is for European values, if not the EU itself, to be prevalent in the way you conduct your life and your politics. It is a protest for transparency. It is probably a protest for personal space, absence of corruption, rule of law. Now, this is the cry, battle cry, almost everywhere in the world. And as I was trying to suggest to you, although these are middle-class demands in many other parts of the world, they are not necessarily democratic demands, that is, liberal demands and democratic participation on the part of the middle classes are not always seen as consistently going together. All these developments, therefore, leave us in a quandary. The democratic systems do not function properly. To the extent that they do, either the majoritarian temptation or the reactionary impulse gain an advantage. Those who rebel against both the inequities of neoliberal economic policies and unresponsive democratic political systems do so with their protests. Potent though these protests are, they are in many cases faceless, leaderless, without a political program. That is their weakness as much as their strength. The task for all who actually wish to change the setup is to find, therefore, the pathway from protest to politics. For the first condition of creating a space for democratic politics of the 21st century is to refashion politics itself. In the age of Twitter and instantaneous gratification of everything, this painstakingly long journey is not terribly attractive. Yet personally, I see no alternative to it. In fact, there is ground to be optimistic that in one fashion or another, a path is found and the protests, or at least their spirit, find their way into the political discourse and ultimately into political reality. Recent developments in the United States, such as the election of a socialist or a social democrat as mayor of New York, after 20 years of Republican rule. I mean, just think of the last or the current mayor of New York. The current mayor of New York is a fellow called Michael Bloomberg. There is no, I mean, there are probably very few names that are above the name Bloomberg in the world financial circles. And this man ran New York with great efficiency, I must confess, for 3 terms, which means 12 years. That his successor is a social democrat, someone who was a militant for the Sandinistas in the late 1980s and 1990s and worked for Catholic charities in Nicaragua, says something about the spirit of the age or the indirect, invisible, unseen impact of Occupy Wall Street, which we all left for dead 2 years ago. Or you can look at the speech on inequality that President Obama finally delivered or dared give last week, suggesting that hope invested in politics is not totally wasted. Grinding though the processes of politics may be, it remains the only way to move forward and reject as fate an unequal distribution of either income or political power. In such an effort, the European Union, more than any other political space in the world, could play a determining or pioneering role. That a continent which gave the world so much that was bad, but also a lot more to aspire for, is currently in such major disrepair is a fact of life. Yet the newly exploding energy and the potential ingenuity of its middle classes would sooner or later define its politics. And this should be the hope of not just Europeans, but the rest of the world as well. I wish now to take you through a case that I know reasonably well. This summer's unexpected, glorious 18 days in Istanbul and 80 of Turkey's 81 provinces. Those demonstrations gave us all a new hope that a new politics will be possible. Not now, not in the immediate future, and I hope before I die. After all, the Turkish government and its majority, as well as majoritarianism, are well and alive. The rule of law, as in the past, is a rare commodity. Freedom of the media and expression are once more on the firing line, and they actually constitute an oxymoron. The bad old habits of authoritarianism, with a clear populist plebeian base, are on the ascendant. To boot, it has a very, very heavy religious tint as well. Yet, and I don't know whether this is politically correct for me to do, to paraphrase what Marx once said of Europe, a spectre is haunting the ruling AKP. As in other places, the full impact of Gezi will only be seen and appreciated in its time. Until such time, like everywhere else, Turkish protest will have to discover its own path to consequential politics. Now, how did we get to that moment of resistance? It wasn't as if the country, particularly the denizens of Istanbul, were strangers to police violence or particularly incensed by it to the degree of ever getting massively and militantly mobilized. Nor was that city best known for its immense sensitivity to environmental concerns. The mistreatment, arrest, beating or gassing of multitudes, including students who are mostly middle class, and their incarceration en masse did not generate any society-wide uneasiness either. De-unionized workers, championship of Turkey in fatal workplace accidents, mistreatment of all the powerless segments of the population barely ever led to a lifting of the eyebrow in general. When the first gathering was called to protect Gezi Park nearly 2.5 years ago, earlier, on a Sunday morning, There was a crowd, mainly composed of usual suspects, that counted maybe 200 and whose median age was not younger than 50, and yours truly was among them. I hugged my own tree too. Neither the square's shop owners nor the residents of the neighborhoods around Taksim, of which Gezi Park was a mistreated, uncared for park, showed up that day. And to be honest, during the following 2.5 years, the efforts of the dedicated group of people trying to safeguard the park and the urban ecology of Taksim Square went almost totally unnoticed outside their own immediate circles. The work they had prepared and submitted to an oblivious public was barely deemed worthy of the media's attention, save for some brave souls who dared to defy the government's potential and always destructive wrath in their editorial columns by taking a critical stance on the Taksim pedestrian transformation project. As for neoliberalism, the rampant construction fetishism of the government and its cronies, the desire to usurp every last inch of public space and turn it into a rent-producing slot, they have been there for at least a decade. As have an uncontrolled materialism and consumerism on the part of those pious classes, rapidly enriching themselves in the booming economy that made a lie of the modesty in lifestyle that defines the more Puritan Islamist Muslims. The destruction of nature and the environment wrought upon Turkey's cities and landscape, the obscene insistence in building a dam on virtually every water flow that exists, failed to move either the complacent or the lately scared, acquiescent, submissive segment of the public. Yet something obviously ticked in the morning of May 31st. That day, for a second day in a row, the massive use of gas at dawn against environmental protesters, the burning of their tents, the relentless brutality of the police finally tipped the scales in a low-key struggle that was going on for 5 days. Why did urban, educated 20 and 30-somethings move out of their comfort zone, participate in a political act that put them at risk of being subjected to intense violence, kept at it for so long, and in the process instigated the single most important unorganized social movement in Turkish history, is a question that will consume social scientists for some time to come. That the urban protests of Istanbul spread like a wildfire, contaminated the mostly sleepy conservative towns of Anatolia, even if briefly, was kept alive in a number of metropolitan cities despite massive police violence, was in itself quite phenomenal. Whether it was, as I said, the right to the city that was being claimed, or the socially conservative measures of the government that began to infringe on the social and personal space of an individualistic crowd, or the creeping political authoritarianism that began to suffocate even the most jaded social networker that caused Gezi, the demonstrations and their spirit transformed Turkey in ways that are both visible and not immediately penetrable. Since you have no obligation to follow Turkish politics day to day, let me please explain for a second what those socially conservative measures and infringement on private lives were. You may or may not know that the Prime Minister of Turkey keeps on ordering all women in Turkey to have 3 kids. Sometimes it's 5. He is against C-section births. He is against abortion, which he considers murder, akin to the murder of 33 Turkish citizens in an Air Force raid on the Kurdish parts of the country. And just immediately on the eve of the Gezi Park protests, a new law regulating alcohol consumption, advertising, sale was just passed, and it was basically interpreted as an effort to actually make more Turks free of alcohol, as the Prime Minister himself demands. Our Prime Minister believes that even a single shot of drink makes you and qualifies you as a irrecuperable alcoholic. So that was the context within which the Gezi crowd basically rebelled against the infringement on their private sphere. By the account of the police, over 3 million citizens joined these protests that echoed the worldwide mobilization of urbanites in a variety of countries. Thus, Turkey became, in my view, truly a contemporary of its times. Before and after the raid on the park, Prime Minister staged massive rallies in Ankara on Saturday, Istanbul on Sunday, and then in other parts of the country. He was showcasing his preferred brand of politics. The populist leader holds forth, the crowds cheer. The message was that these crowds represented the majority of the real population. The resistance in the park was a conspiracy against his government, and its roots were outside the country. The world media were biased and aiding the demonstrators. There was evidence that nefarious lobbies, understand the Jewish lobby, abroad were involved in coordinating the protests. This was a cartoon version of the nationalist rhetoric of yore, maintaining that the nation is a solid bloc and any dissent is the fault of enemies, internal or external. Turks are familiar with this. It was the favorite trope of the military coups in 1960, 71 and 80, but more saliently, it is still the dominant tenor of school textbooks. The question is whether it still resonates. Almost all the protesters in Gezi Park were young people with no direct experience of military rule or state repression. They were the beneficiaries of economic growth and greater openness to the world. They now wanted the basic rights that they knew existed elsewhere. They wanted to be able to defend public space against neoliberal incursion, and they refused to live under the authoritarian guidance of a self-appointed father of the country. They felt at home in a collective way of life, with gender equality and respect for diversity. A recipe for a new covenant that makes irrelevant the pretensions of Erdogan's supposedly benevolent and now wrathful paternalism. It might once have been possible for the political class to dismiss their demands as the aspirations of a cosmopolitan minority in Istanbul. But their resistance found widespread and unexpected support in many urban areas with a rich mix of civil disobedience, demonstrations, and street politics. Erdogan has to take some credit for this, dialectically speaking. His regime has achieved the rare feat of ridding the country of military tutelage and presided over a decade of stability. Young people were diverted away from the baroque politics of earlier periods, for which they were unjustly accused of being apolitical. At the same time, Erdogan's government allocated more money to education. Turkey now has some 200 universities, which leave a lot to be desired, and more than 4 million university students who leave even more to be desired. 2.5 million new graduates have been added to the population since 2008. These figures portend a new middle-class formation whose members work in relatively modern workplaces with leisure time and consumption habits much like their global counterparts. But they also look for new guarantees for their way of life, for their environment, for their right to the city, and they resent violations of their personal and social space. As Çağlar Keder succinctly summarizes, the Gezi protests were the first social movement to stem from this new reality. It is evident that the old guard don't know how to respond to a challenge that lies outside their understanding of politics as a struggle to rule. The government's response is at the level of greater coercion. They keep trying to find the culprits and redouble police powers to repress any hint of dissent. In their panic, they variously rage against the haute bourgeoisie of Istanbul, the European Parliament, and their former supporters. They seem to have given up on hegemony and are banking on violent domination. This inability to deal with the movement in its own terms led the governing party and its elites to malign Gezi and its participants. As repression continues, the efforts to mobilize the conservative base and keep it on high alert are intensified. As a force between the late Hugo Chavez of Venezuela and Vladimir Putin, the Turkish Prime Minister steamrolls any and all opposition and tightens up the apparatus of repression. Meanwhile, the protesters' displays of fraternity, resistance, creativity and humor expose the failure of the tutelary regime. Erdogan's project to be anointed an omnipotent president through a change in the constitution is now probably, at least for some time, no more than a dream. The newcomers to the political arena may not yet be in a position to draft a new set of rules, but they have shifted the keystone that supports Turkey's patriarchal firmament. The humor and the burst of creative energy we witnessed in Gezi and elsewhere will put their stamp on Turkey's political future sooner or later. In the meantime, the reproduction of the repressive tools and habits of the Turkish political system will exert a high cost from the new middle classes as well as from the prestige and once indomitable promise of a new Turkey. Waiting for that time when humor would finally and ultimately prevail over bullyism, freedom and justice would suffer temporarily, I assure you. Thank you.
Сега имате възможност да зададете въпроси. Аз предлагам да съберем първо няколко въпроси. Получим отговорите и тогава още един кръг от въпроси. Така. Думата е ваша. Задавайте въпроси на български, на английски, езика, на който се чувствате по-добре. I'm sure they'll be good. Така, докато разсъждавате, може би аз да задам един въпрос, за да разчупим леда. Когато слушах вашата много интересна лекция, така от една страна, разбира се, съм съгласен с това, че средната класа и тази средна класа, която може би е дори въображаема, и тази средна класа, която се страхува, че нейният статут така се подронва и в основата на много от тези протести, които се случват, и че това представлява проблем за съвременната демокрация. Доколко обаче тази средна класа все още е гръбнака на съвременната либерална демокрация? Не е ли тя притисната от една страна от едни много богати елити, които все повече и повече не са свързани с националната държава, са глобални. И от друга страна от едни маси, които са все повече от вътрешна имиграция и те също някакси не се чувстват свързани с националната държава, но страха е, че това е по-скоро дефанзивна реакция на една средна класа, която така или иначе вече е загубила позициите си. Какво смятате по този въпрос? Наистина песимистична ли картината или може би е по-оптимистична, отколкото аз се представям?
I was told this afternoon that I should be someone who sees the full half of the glass. I do actually. In that, again, it's not going to be easy, but let's take it this way. In the United States, the top 1% of the population used to get about 6 to 8% of national income 35 years ago, back in 1978. Just last year, in 2012, according to the American census data, the top 1% received 20 to 22% of national income, and 10% of the population received a full 48.2% of income. So if you look at it that way, yes, indeed, there is a defensive reaction to the prospect of a future where you have really no prospects of life, all right? But that reaction, that resistance can take different political courses. One course is the Tea Party course, okay? We want our country back. What do you mean by we want our country back? Well, what are all these blacks and browns and others doing in our turf? White America is dying out. And you look at their demography, that's over 45 years, white males. Okay? But there is another response that is also stemming from, exactly from that feeling of being squeezed out, and that was Occupy Wall Street. Okay? Occupy Wall Street is prototypical movement profile that I tried to outline. 25 to 35, university educated, totally wired, you know, looking around the world, connected. Remember, they invited people from Tahrir Square and all that. They are also incensed, but they are proposing something else. What they're saying is that 35-year trend of moving the share of income for the top 1% from 6 to 8 to about 22, 24 is not sustainable. In the meantime, middle class incomes have at best stagnated. Okay? Therefore, equality, if you will, becomes the rising slogan of this new middle class. Okay? New in sense that it is part of the new economy and all that. Now, to the extent that this is the constituency that actually elected Barack Obama, to the extent that this is probably the constituency that is going to be able to bring coalitions in some parts of the United States to elect the likes of the mayor of New York. There will be another socialist in Seattle. If you look at the state of Minnesota, which is the twin of Wisconsin, but with very different preferences in policy choices, then I think this is how you're going to start negotiating new policies with politics. Again, the distinction that Ivan makes between, okay, one size fits all, you only have one set of alternatives as policies, that takes away from politics, okay? And what we're seeing now, and I think that was the point, I wanted to make at the end, the period of complacency, because you were getting by and because you could actually preoccupy yourself with your family, friends, and whatever, that period of complacency is no more. Because the crisis is biting everyone. All right? And again, in Europe, this is a struggle between the older generations and the younger generations. In developing countries, it will be a struggle about a better life on different aspects. But at any rate, this at least opens up space for politics. It's going to be very hard. Repressive apparatuses are, Robocops are everywhere. It is no longer possible to distinguish scenes from one place to another. Right? It's the same Robocops, it's the same gas, and it's the same water hoses. Okay? But I think it opens up the possibility. And by the way, this will necessitate a final struggle with financial capital, because ultimately this is what, in the American case that I know better, the top 1% received 92% of the recovery. And That is truly unconscionable in a democratic society. So you're either going to give up, on democracy, or you're going to change the way income is distributed. Obama's speech in that sense was a step in the right direction, but of course with Obama you always run into the following problem. The speeches are just like, oh my God, you feel like butter on a hot plate, but the follow-up never comes. But still, the health insurance, with all the stupid problems that they were responsible for, is such a major step in the right direction that it may change the context of America's politics. And that will then be, that will have repercussions everywhere.
We talked a little bit today, earlier, about what the protests are actually about. And
protests are?
What the protests are about in Turkey, in Bulgaria, and elsewhere. And I really think it's important to make the point that it's not about income, and it's not about left and right. In our cases, it's much more about the rules of the game, about why morality has become kind of a politically incorrect word in politics, in policy making. Right now in Ukraine, we have a crackdown happening as we speak. And the question that very often we think about is to which extent it is good or not good for the outside world to react to this. Simply because it's not left or right, it's not party politics, it's about a higher stake, so to say. So is it moral for the outside world to sit on the fence and watch this going on and think that, this is how a country becomes a serious one, by fighting its own battles, by having its own society ripen? Or does it have to, the outside world, does it have to intervene? I'm deliberately not using the phrase international community because it has other connotations. But what do you think? I mean, right now, as the police is really dismantling the camps on the streets of Kiev.
Well, first of all, on the first point you made, I don't think this is explicable with economics alone. And in fact, in the text that I read, I suggested that in the Ukraine, it is obviously the interests of these guys that are going to be hurt, but it goes beyond it. But that still doesn't take away from a general context of insecurity and uncertainty that inflicts almost everyone for a whole variety of reasons. So that's the background, if you will. And to the extent that justice and equality became rallying cries, they are related to this, but there are, of course, all sorts of other things. And of course, to the extent that I understood it in the Bulgarian case and in the Ukrainian case, there is also a choice wanting to be part of a system, however, in this regard it may be the European Union one, but because of the values, principles, institutions that exist, you really want to be part of that rather than the new Tsar. Okay. As for the role of the outsiders, quite frankly, we live in a time where nobody can make moral claims against anyone else, and that makes the job of outsiders very difficult. Okay. It's a world grown very cynical, and if you're going to do anything to help any force in any given country, it will have to be indirect, painfully slow, and the results of which may be seen not immediately, but maybe in 2, 3, 4 years. And that is the best, let's say, in this case, the European Union can do vis-à-vis with the Ukraine. The Russians have an immediate weapon to use. They raise the price of gas, the Ukrainians freeze, okay? The European Union has a lot of other mechanisms, but they will only work their way through with difficulty. They can also, the outsiders can also make life very difficult for Ukraine's rulers, to the extent that they care, all right? But apart from that, there isn't really all that much to do, because we've always lived through this conflicting or tension-ridden dilemma. That is it better if your country is reprimanded and ostracized, or is it better that others actually help forces on the ground to actually gather more force and more power? My sense is the second is far more important. It takes a lot more time. It is less satisfying if you seek revenge, but to strengthen the forces on the ground strikes me as really the most important thing to do. And if you look at Iraq, for instance, before the war, the Iraqi middle class was obliterated by 12 years of sanctions. So there was no force to actually stop Saddam Hussein, to oppose Saddam Hussein, or after Saddam was deposed to actually take over. Okay? Now, Iran was an interesting case. In Iran, the middle classes suffered a lot, but so did regime's forces, because that was how the sanctions were actually engineered. And now the pressure of the middle classes in a regime which, by the way, and I haven't mentioned Iran, it was a mistake of mine. 2009 Iran was truly a breaking point in developments for a lot of places, but certainly in Iran, a regime that lost its legitimacy ultimately, again, only 4 years later perhaps, but ultimately had to make a deal with the outside world. It is still touchy, it is still maybe fragile, but that is the direction that they had to take, because there was still a middle class that could hold the shots. So to strengthen that, in my view, the forces on the ground is far more important, because otherwise states can live happily crushing their own subjects, their own populations forever, to the extent that they can do.
Моят въпрос е свързан с така новата роля, която вие приписвате на средната класа, и по-скоро като имаме предвид, че средната класа винаги е била оценявана като онази група, която създава рационалния избирател, медианния избирател. Онази група, която без емоция, балансирано, в последна сметка избира кой ще управлява. От гледна точка на теория на, на избирател, на поведението на избирателите. Мислите ли или оценявате ли, всъщност това са 3 въпроса, които искам да дам. Първо, тази нова форма на колективно действие, което вие наблюдавате, означава ли, че средната класа е поводяла, в смисъл станала прекалено емоционална, загубила онази си функция, която винаги е играла в либералните демокрации? Ако мислите, че е така, това означава ли, че изборният процес губи значението си във всичките тези държави, където наблюдаваме тези протести на средната класа, или нещо друго означава? И третият ми въпрос е: какви според вас ще бъдат последиците от тази промяна?
Може би е сериозно социологическо предизвикателство да говорим за средна класа днес, защото средна класа в средата на 20 век означаваше повишаващия се брой относителен дял хора с достатъчни доходи, за да си позволят това, което днес се нарича масово потребление. От това се разви една специфична нова индивидуалистична култура на икономическо потребление, на икономическо поведение. От това се разви една нова комюнитарна култура в лявата част на спектъра. Днес по-скоро ми се струва, че трябва да говорим не за средна класа, а за средни класи, различни образи на средната класа. Средна класа е и консервативната средна класа в Анадола днес, която подкрепя твърде активно партията на господин Ердоан, АКП. Средна класа са и левите интелектуалци. Средна класа са и нов тип предприемачи и така нататък и така нататък. Ако трябва да говорим за това какво всъщност осмисля бунтовете на средната класа и на средните класи, може би се струва да се фокусираме върху проблема до каква степен представителната демокрация, традиционната представителна демокрация на 20 век действително работи в съвременните условия. Не се ли изпразват от съдържание механизмите на представителната демокрация от две гледни точки? Първо, от гледна точка на представителство на много динамично развиващо се общество в глобален контекст, и второ, от гледна точка на отговорност, която обществото изисква от вече избраните свои представители. Тук имаме протест срещу цинизма на имитираното представителство. Имаме протест срещу мощните ресурси за манипулация на публиката от страна на елитите. Имаме протест и срещу невъзможността на политическата система да създаде минимално общо пространство на консенсус, което да направи обществата възможни. Ние много се гордеем с това, че сме мултикултурни, само че не само културите трябва да бъдат множествени, а трябва да могат да живеят заедно. Всичко това са аспекти на средната класа и на нейния протест. Това не е въпрос, просто се опитвам да разсъждавам по тези проблеми и ще ми бъде интересно да чуя вашето мнение.
Chairman, the silence was better. These are extraordinarily good questions, some of which I tried to touch upon, but obviously failed to deal with in a more detailed form. First of all, obviously, the concept middle class is a nebulous concept. It is not. That's why I wanted to make at least one distinction between status middle classes and market middle classes, and yours are also as good left, conservative entrepreneurs and what have you. Now, I really don't think the middle classes have gone mad. No. They are responding to something, whether that something is their culture, a threat that they feel against their cultural codes about, or their private lives, social lives, as in Turkey, or because there is a high degree of insecurity about their future. It probably changes from one example to another. For instance, in India, the middle class revolt for transparency and accountability is a backhanded way of asking the Indian state not to help the poor. In that sense, there is a contradiction between the liberalism of the middle classes and what democracy requires, which is the participation of the population. So in that sense, it isn't just capitalism and democracy that may be at odds. Liberalism and democracy as well were at odds until about the 19th century, that certain formulas were found to bring them together. Now, the problem of the middle classes, unless they're going to go nationalist, unless they're going to use nationalist slogans, and there are some parts of it that do, you cannot really mobilize the population on liberal principles. I mean, transparency is wonderful and good, and so is accountability, but they are not rallying cries for mass movements. So to that extent, I think the middle classes are basically trying to defend a certain way of life, economically, politically, and socially, and if they think it's being infringed upon, they are reacting to it. Does the electoral process has any meaning? The electoral process has a lot of meaning, but I think the electoral process in places where the politicians are either unwilling or incapable of responding to the emerging demands of a more complicated societies, leave us face to face with the threat of liberal institutions being overwhelmed by democratic participation and democratic demands. Now, you cannot, in my view, deny democratic legitimacy, which is represented through the electoral process. On the other hand, as I tried to touch upon a couple of times in my presentation as well, in every single country almost, you risk majoritarianism gaining the upper hand. And that is in fact now entering the discourse as well. Not the right of minorities, but the will of the majority actually defining democracy. I don't know how one is going to be dealing with that, but that will be something we will have to confront. In that sense, I don't think the electoral process has lost either its legitimacy or its meaning. But the thing is, the meaning it has today may be very different from the meaning it has had, let's say, in mid-70s or mid-80s. Consequences of the change, I suspect, is the need to forge a new politics for the 21st century. Don't ask me what the formula of it would be, but that is what I think all of us, and I think you made the point, what is the space for consensual politics? How do we redefine that? And I think that is a challenge not just for this country or my country, but that is a challenge for many other countries as well. Can decentralization be a way out of that quandary? I don't know, but that is something to really, I think, to really think about. By the way, consumption, if I may, in your comment, when you look at people who work on the definition of middle class, they say people who make $4 to $10 a day, so it's anywhere from 4,000 to 50,000 a year, depending on purchasing power parity and stuff like that. And so so the middle class is being defined as a consumer. But again, if we go back to the classical 19th century theories, there what we have is, we have maybe bourgeois, but we don't have citizens, okay? So how do you recreate or regenerate this spirit, this public spirit of citizenry in people who are being defined only in terms of their income and in terms of their consumption? And there you have to get into even more mind territory of what do you do with capitalism as it exists today. And that is really the task of politics, but for that politics to succeed, you will have to find a common language between groups whose interests are evidently not in harmony anymore, or as they used to before. Especially at a time when the repressive apparatuses of the state are gaining ground, but the material or the fiscal abilities of the state are declining.
Soli, thanks a lot for your characteristically stimulating speech, and I couldn't resist but ask a Turkey-specific question. The beauty of the Gezi protest was bringing together a very diverse set of voices and actors. But over time, don't you think that polarization became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and what started as a civic upheaval ended up being the same old secularist uprising that is prone to be harnessed by the opposition? I mean, you see a lot of Alevis, for example, so the sectarian angle was added on top of it, and there is this criticism. Now, this is a very familiar criticism here as well, by the way. It's something that started as an authentic civic movement ended up being recycled into the familiar patterns of ideological politics. Now, to be clear, I don't think it applies to Bulgaria. But is there something about Turkey that, what was a kind of post-AKP, post-secularist versus pious uprising, with many different actors involved, nationalists, seculars, Kurds, young people who are apolitical before, ended up into the same familiar pattern of seculars versus the AKP?
Професор Йозел, бих искал да попитам, има два турски вестника, които, когато имам възможност, чета с удоволствие.
Един е Zaman Today, а другия е Hürriyet Daily. Това, което оставам с впечатление от тези два вестника, е, че в Турция на практика съществуват два културни свята. Въпросът ми е, верно ли е това впечатление и как виждате тези два културни свята, както ви намекнах, да станат един, може би, или множество различни свята?
Yeah, there are two cultural universes in Turkey, you're absolutely right. In fact, if you read all Turkish newspapers, you basically realize that there are alternative realities in Turkey. And those alternative realities may be political, but it is also true that there is culturally two universes. On the other hand, I must say, there is also one overpowering and all-encompassing culture that unifies those two different cultures, and that's consumerism. It does, okay? So where do we go from that? I really do not know, and the Prime Minister wishes to make sure that this bifurcation along cultural lines continues, because he also is now very clear that he wishes to establish, and I get to your question, Dimitar, that he wishes to create a country which is, by and large, politically semi-authoritarian, in economic management, technocratically savvy, like Asiatic ones, and socially very conservative, defined by religious precepts. Okay. Now, and that, of course, is to revolutionize Turkey's politics. Whether he can succeed in that, I don't know. But before that, you mentioned that Alevis made up a large bulk of the Gezi participants. For those who are not aware of it, in Turkey there are two main denominations. What? Here? Okay. Anyway, then you, okay, there are two major denominations, Alevis and Sunnis. AKP is a hardcore Sunni party, and although it tries to do something for the Alevis, it cannot get itself to actually level with them, okay? And in the process of the Gezi protests, 5 individuals were killed. All 5 turned out to be Alevis. So, for an Alevi, it would be very difficult to believe that this was not deliberate. And for the Sunnis, it would be very difficult to believe that the Alevis were not trying an insurrection. But I disagree with you that that Gezi deteriorated into a secularist Alevi protest. First of all, it happened in 80 different cities. And not all cities had Alevi populations, and whether or not some groups tried to appropriate it as such, I think it was bigger than that. How will a post-secular, post-AKP Turkey look? I think what that Turkey will look like is going to depend on how hard the struggle that we're undergoing is going to turn out to be. Whether or not the big bloody fight between two religious groups, I love it, you know. When a crass, blatant, naked battle for political power is being sugar-coated with quotations from the Quran and religious principles and allusions to incidents in Islamic history, I find sickening, but that is what's happening. So we'll just have to see how the politics of Islamists is corroding religion itself on the part of the population. But so long as the AKP manages to run the country, I really don't see any breakup. But whatever post-secularist, post-AKP Turkey will look like, it will be not unlike what Turkey used to be prior to, which is not a bad thing, by the way. which is not a bad thing. The real question I have is not about the degree of importance religion may have in the country's life, but whether or not this habit of resurrecting, recreating, reproducing the authoritarian mechanisms of managing or ruling the country is going to continue forever. Because if that is going to happen, Turkey is going to crack under its own weight. And the Kurds and others will have a lot of thinking to do. Turks did not participate in Gezi in an organized fashion. If there was anything happening in Diyarbakir or in Hakkari at the scale that they were capable of mobilizing, the fate of the Gezi movement would have been different as well. But the more we see that this government has serious limits in liberalizing the Turkish polity, a lot of diverse groups are going to come together sooner or later. So we'll see. It's really a process in the making.
Имаме време за още въпроси, така че...
Аз бих искала да задам малко по-общ въпрос. Вие няколко пъти споменахте думата демокрация. Всъщност, какво за вас е демокрацията? И мислите ли, че човек все още не е готов за демокрация и ние всъщност сме свидетел на всички тези революции, които се случват в цялата човешка история?
No, first, I really don't think human beings are not ready for democracy. That is not an idea that I entertain. But we do have a question of how we define democracy at any given age, because every age has its own circumstances, and democracy, as John Keane in a book, which is very thick, argues, goes in cycles, redefines itself, resurrects, and whatever. And I think we are basically struggling to find a democratic order with its mechanisms that could be functional and that could respond to the demands and the realities of the 21st century. It is very difficult to sustain a nationally democratic order when the economy is globally organized and the political systems of the countries are organized on a nation-state basis. And that's the main dilemma that is making the art of running countries or the task of the politicians very, very difficult. As for what I understand democracy to me, in its very simple terms, it is obviously the participation of citizenry in determining how they're going to be governed, and their ability and right to participate in the making of decisions that are going to determine their lives. On the other hand, you also have to raise the following question: how do we properly balance the democratic dynamics of any given polity with the desire to protect those who happen to be in minority? Individual rights and collective rights, how are they going to be protected? Where do you strike the balance between minority rights versus majorities rule? And those are questions that have been with us since modern democracies have begun to take shape, and those questions are still with us, and in that sense, democracy is still a project in the making as well. But certain principles are undeniably there. If we give up on those, then we really cannot build democracies.
Well, on this optimistic note, I suggest that we finish. Позволете ми да благодаря на Центъра за либерални стратегии, на професор Озел за тази много интересна и богата на идеи лекция. Дискусията също че беше интересна. Така че благодаря ви.
I think